Imagine finding out that everything you thought you knew about your family, your blood, your roots, your identity, was only half the story. Now imagine that happening to an entire nation, tens of millions of people, all at once. That is exactly what happened when scientists cracked open the DNA of the Italian people and found something buried so deep, so ancient, so completely unexpected, that even the researchers themselves had to stop and read the results twice. Because what came back from those genetic sequences didn't just rewrite Italian history, it rewrote human history in Europe. And the deeper they looked, the more unsettling and extraordinary it became. This is not a story about bloodlines you can trace to a great-grandmother. This is not about a surname that sounds a little too Greek or a nose that runs in the family. This is about populations that existed before recorded history, before the Romans, before the Greeks, before language as we know it, before farming, before civilization itself had a name. And somehow, impossibly, traces of those people, their DNA, their biological fingerprint, are still alive inside millions of Italians walking the earth today in 2025. Some of those Italians are living past 100 years old, and scientists now believe that ancient, hidden ancestry might be the very reason why. So sit with that for a moment. The secret to extreme longevity in one of the world's most celebrated cultures might have been quietly written in genetic code that is tens of thousands of years old. Code from people who hunted wild animals across frozen European landscapes during the Ice Age. Code that survived every empire, every invasion, every plague, every migration that swept across the Italian peninsula across the millennia. And nobody knew it was there. Not really, not until now. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the Roman beginning, not the Renaissance beginning, the real beginning. Around 15,000 years ago, as the last great ice age was slowly loosening its grip on Europe, small bands of hunter-gatherers moved across the landscape that would one day become Italy. These people left no written records, no monuments, no cities. They left bones. They left tools made of flint and bone, and they left something else, something invisible and silent that has now survived longer than any stone carving or ceramic pot. They left their DNA. Scientists call this group the Western hunter-gatherers, and for a very long time, geneticists assumed they had been almost completely replaced by the waves of farmers and conquerors that came after them. That assumption, it turns out, was wrong, profoundly wrong. Then, roughly 8,000 years ago, something seismic happened. A population of farmers from Anatolia, the region we now call Turkey, began moving westward into Europe. They brought with them an entirely new way of living. They grew crops. They kept animals. They built permanent settlements. And wherever they went, they mixed with the hunter-gatherers already living there, slowly absorbing them numerically, overwhelming them with their larger farming communities and their higher birth rates. In Italy, this Anatolian wave hit hard. When geneticists today analyze the DNA of modern Italians, they find that the single largest component of their ancestry traces back to these Anatolian Neolithic farmers. In northern Italians, this component can reach as high as 72%. Even in southern Italy, it runs at around 56%. The farming revolution, it turns out, didn't just change how people ate. It fundamentally rewrote who they were at a genetic level. But the story doesn't stop there, not even close. Around 5,000 years ago, a third wave arrived. And this one came not from the warm south or the fertile east, but from the wild, windswept grasslands north of the Black Sea. Archaeologists and geneticists call them the Yamnaya. They were nomadic pastoralists, herders of cattle and horses, and they moved with a speed and force that reshaped the genetic landscape of Europe in ways we are still trying to fully understand. These were the people who, many researchers believe, spread the Indo-European languages across Europe, the family of languages from which Latin, Italian, Greek, English, and dozens of others all descend. They carried a genetic signature shaped by a mix of Eastern European hunter-gatherers and ancient populations from the Caucasus Mountains. And when they swept into Europe, they didn't just trade and interact, they replaced. In some parts of Northern and Central Europe, they replaced existing male populations so completely that the genetic signature is almost total. In Italy, the impact was significant but more complex, shaped by geography, by the natural barriers of the Alps, by the peninsula's position reaching into the Mediterranean. And then there is a fourth ancestral layer, one that is subtler but equally fascinating. Ancient populations related to Neolithic groups from Iran and the Caucasus region, whose genetic traces spread along the Mediterranean coastline through maritime routes, arriving in southern Italy and Sicily in ways that were entirely separate from the steppe migration. 4 completely distinct ancient populations, all of them mixed into one, all of them present in varying degrees in the DNA of modern Italians. And for most of human history, nobody knew any of this. Now here is where the story takes its most extraordinary turn. Here is where science stops being just history and starts being something that could change medicine and our understanding of human life itself. In 2025, A team of researchers at the University of Bologna, led by scientists Stefania Sarno and Vincenzo Iannuzzi, published a study in the journal Geroscience that made scientists around the world lean forward in their chairs. Italy, as many people know, has one of the highest concentrations of centenarians, people living past 100 years, of anywhere on Earth. Certain regions, particularly in Sardinia and parts of southern Italy, have long been studied as so-called blue zones, places where people routinely live dramatically longer than the global average. Researchers have spent decades trying to understand why. They have looked at diet, at stress levels, at community bonds, at the Mediterranean lifestyle, and all of those things matter. But this new study suggested something far deeper was also at play, something written into the DNA itself thousands of years before any of these people were born. The research team analyzed the complete genome data of 333 Italian centenarians, people who had already beaten the biological odds by surviving past their 100th birthday. They then compared this genetic data to 690 healthy adult Italians around the age of 50, who served as the control group. But here is what made the study genuinely groundbreaking. They didn't just compare modern Italians to each other. They went further back. They compared both groups against the ancient DNA of 103 individuals drawn from those 4 ancestral populations: the Ice Age hunter-gatherers, the Anatolian farmers, the Bronze Age steppe nomads, and the Iranian Caucasus groups. They were essentially asking the genome a direct question: which of your ancient ancestors are most represented in the people who live the longest? The answer was staggering. The centenarians, the people living past 100, showed a statistically significant higher proportion of DNA from the Western hunter-gatherers compared to the control group. Not the farmers, not the steppe nomads, not the Caucasus groups, the hunter-gatherers, the Ice Age people, the ones everyone assumed had been almost completely replaced and absorbed thousands of years ago. Those people. Their genetic legacy, still quietly present in certain Italian bloodlines, appears to be connected, not coincidentally, but significantly in the statistical sense of that word, to the ability to survive longer than almost anyone else on the planet. Think about what that means. These centenarians were born between 1901 and 1913. They lived through 2 world wars. They survived the 1918 influenza pandemic, one of the deadliest disease events in human history. They grew old without antibiotics, without modern cardiac surgery, without the full weight of 21st century medicine behind them. And something in their DNA, something inherited from people who hunted mammoths and sheltered in caves during the Ice Age, may have quietly protected them across every decade of that extraordinary century. The researchers were careful, as good scientists always are, to note that this is a correlation, not a proven direct cause. There is no single longevity gene that has been identified and linked definitively to hunter-gatherer ancestry. The biology is almost certainly complex, involving dozens or hundreds of genetic variants working in combination, influencing inflammation pathways, immune system function, cardiovascular resilience, and cellular repair mechanisms in ways that science is only beginning to map. But the statistical signal is real. It is significant. And it points with surprising clarity toward those ancient people of the Ice Age as carrying something, some biological advantage, that has not fully disappeared from the human population even after 15,000 years of mixing and migration. This is not a marginal finding. This was published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. The methodology was rigorous, the sample size was substantial, and the implications stretch far beyond Italy. If a genetic echo from Ice Age hunter-gatherers is influencing human longevity in Italian centenarians today, what else might ancient ancestry be quietly shaping in modern populations? What other hidden biological legacies are coded into our genomes, invisible to us, waiting for science to find the right question to ask? But let's pull back from the longevity discovery for a moment, because there is another layer of this story that deserves equal attention. The genetic history of southern Italy and Sicily is its own extraordinary chapter, one that rewrites the narrative of who those populations actually are at a foundational level. Sicily sits in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea like a crossroads with no exit. Every major civilization that rose to power in the ancient Mediterranean world either wanted it, conquered it, or passed through it. The Greeks arrived in the 8th century BC and established colonies that became so culturally dominant that the region was called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece. The Phoenicians, those legendary maritime traders from the coast of what is now Lebanon, established their own colonies on the western side of the island around the same time. The Carthaginians from North Africa fought Rome over Sicily in the Punic Wars, and their presence left biological traces as well as ruins. The Romans conquered it, the Byzantine Greeks held it, Arab armies took it in the 9th century, the Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France, swept down from the north in the 11th century and added yet another layer. Every one of these groups left genetic traces in the modern Sicilian population. When researchers conducted detailed genomic analysis of modern Sicilians in studies published across recent years and continuing through 2025, they found exactly what this history would predict, and a few things it didn't. The dominant genetic component, as across Italy, traces to Anatolian Neolithic farmers. But layered on top of that foundation are detectable traces of post-Neolithic Levantine ancestry, consistent with Phoenician and Bronze Age maritime migrations from the eastern Mediterranean. There are traces of North African ancestry, small but real, consistent with centuries of contact and occasional settlement from across the narrow strait. There are strong signals of Greek genetic influence, particularly in eastern Sicily and coastal southern Italy, consistent with the massive and sustained Greek colonization of Magna Graecia. But here is something remarkable that the DNA revealed that pure history books could not fully show. Modern southern Italians are genetically closer to Greek island populations, particularly those of the Aegean Islands, than they are to mainland continental Greeks. That specificity matters. It suggests the Greek ancestry present in southern Italy and Sicily didn't come primarily from the Greek mainland as a whole, but rather from specific Aegean Island communities, likely the actual source populations of the ancient colonists who founded cities like Siracusa, Crotone, and Taranto. The DNA preserved that geographic specificity across 2,500 years. And there is something else. A 2025 study published in Communications Biology examined ancient human DNA extracted from skeletal remains at Grotta della Monica, a cave in Calabria in the deep south of Italy, where a Bronze Age community lived approximately 3,500 years ago. The findings were remarkable on multiple levels. The genomes of the cave community showed the familiar mixture of Anatolian Neolithic, Western hunter-gatherer, and steppe ancestries expected for Bronze Age Italians, but they lacked the Eastern Mediterranean genetic influences found in contemporary Sicilians, suggesting that at the time of the Bronze Age, the genetic landscape of southern Italy was still relatively uniform and had not yet received the layers of Phoenician, Greek, and Near Eastern ancestry that later arrivals would deposit. The community appears to have been genetically cohesive, relatively isolated, practicing burial, rituals organized by kinship and sex. And among the most astonishing findings from this cave, researchers identified direct genetic evidence of a parent-offspring union, a biological relationship between individuals buried together that represented the first unambiguous genetic proof of such a close kin pairing ever documented in prehistoric Europe. A community so isolated, so self-contained, that the DNA itself tells a story of tight kinship bonds across generations. These Bronze Age Italians were not who we thought they were, and the modern Italians who carry fragments of their genetic legacy are not entirely who the history book suggested either. Now let's talk about the North-South divide, because no conversation about Italian genetics is complete without it. For centuries, there have been cultural and political narratives about differences between northern and southern Italians, differences in economy, in culture, in temperament, in physical appearance. Some of these narratives have been used shamefully to justify discrimination. What genetics has done is strip away this mythology and replace it with data. And the data tells a nuanced, fascinating, and ultimately humanizing story. The genetic gradient running from northern to southern Italy is real. It is measurable. It exists on a spectrum. Northern Italians show higher proportions of Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry, in some clusters reaching above 70%, and higher amounts of the steppe-related ancestry brought by the Bronze Age Yamnaya migrations. Southern Italians, including Sicilians, show lower Anatolian percentages, more Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, and additional layers of Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern admixture not present at the same levels in the north. Sardinians occupy a position apart from both, so heavily Anatolian Neolithic in composition, with values above 80%, that they represent the closest living genetic relatives of those ancient Neolithic farmers, a kind of living time capsule of Europe's first agricultural communities. But here is what is crucial to understand. This gradient is a spectrum, not a division. There is no genetic line separating northern and southern Italians into distinct populations. The variation is clinal, meaning it shifts gradually across geography, the way a sunset shifts from one color to another without a hard boundary. Every Italian carries all four of those ancient ancestral threads in their DNA. The proportions vary. The mixture is slightly different depending on where your family has lived for the past few thousand years. But the fundamental human story is the same. Multiple ancient peoples, arriving across thousands of years from different directions, slowly blending into a single population with a genetic complexity that reflects the full weight of European prehistory. It is worth pausing on that complexity, because it has a particular power in today's world. In a time when questions of identity, ancestry, and origin are politically charged and sometimes weaponized, the science of genomics quietly delivers a humbling message. There is no genetically pure population anywhere on Earth. Italians, whose culture has for centuries been romanticized as the inheritors of a single glorious Roman civilization, are in genetic terms a layered mosaic of Ice Age survivors, Turkish farmers, Eurasian steppe nomads, Iranian highland peoples, Aegean Greek colonists, Levantine traders, and North African influences. Every group that helped build the Mediterranean world left traces in the bodies of the people who came after them. The Romans themselves, for all their self-mythologizing about descent from Romulus and Remus and the divine bloodline of Troy, were the genetic products of the same complex mixing. The Latin tribes who founded Rome were themselves the descendants of Bronze Age peoples who carried steppe ancestry, Anatolian Neolithic ancestry, and hunter-gatherer ancestry in their genomes. The empire they built was not the product of genetic purity. It was the product of a deeply mixed, deeply ancient, and deeply human population that happened to organize itself with extraordinary military and political genius at a particular moment in history. And now, thanks to the technology of ancient DNA analysis, a field that barely existed 20 years ago and has transformed almost entirely in the past decade, we can read that history not in texts or coins or ruins, but in the biological code carried in the cells of people living today. Let's return one final time to those centenarians, because their story carries something almost poetic that science alone can't fully capture. These were people born in the early years of the 20th century. Many of them grew up in small villages in the Italian countryside, eating simple food, working with their hands, living close to community and family and land. When they were young, nobody knew what DNA was. When they were middle-aged, the structure of the double helix had only just been discovered. When they turned 70, 80, 90, 100, and kept going, scientists began to wonder what made them different. And now, deep into the 21st century, the answer begins to emerge from the genome itself, not from their lifestyle alone, not from their diet alone, not from their faith or their family structure, though all of those things almost certainly matter too, but from something written into them before they were born, something written into their ancestors before those ancestors were born, something that traces back through an unbroken chain of human reproduction spanning hundreds of generations to people who never farmed, never built a city, never wrote a word, but who ran across the wild landscapes of Ice Age Europe and somehow passed forward a biological resilience that the millennia could not erase. That is not mythology. That is not poetry dressed up as science. That is what the data says. That is what peer-reviewed research published in 2025, using some of the most sophisticated genomic analysis tools ever developed, has found written in the DNA of people who lived past 100 years in one of the most studied human populations on Earth. And it raises a question that genomics is now beginning to ask with increasing urgency across every human population. What else is hidden in our DNA that we don't yet know about? What other ancient voices are speaking through our biology, shaping our health, our longevity, our susceptibility to disease, our response to medicine, and have been doing so for thousands of years in complete silence, waiting for science to finally learn how to listen? Italy, with its extraordinary depth of history and the richness of its genetic record, has given us one of the most vivid answers yet. But it is almost certainly not the last. The story of human ancestry is not a story of origins and endpoints. It is not a straight line from ancient people to modern people. It is a web, a vast, tangled, beautiful web of migrations and minglings and survivals and replacements and unexpected continuities. And every time scientists pull on one thread, whether it is the genome of an Italian centenarian living quietly in Bologna, or the ancient bones of a Bronze Age family buried in a cave in Calabria 3,500 years ago, the web reveals itself to be older, more complex, and more astonishing than anyone had previously imagined. The people of Italy did not simply descend from Romans. They descended from the Ice Age. They descended from the first farmers who crossed from Asia into Europe. They descended from nomadic herders who rode across the steppes, speaking the ancestor language of half the world's languages today. They descended from Phoenician traders and Greek colonists and ancient peoples from the mountains of the Caucasus. They are, in the truest genetic sense, not just the children of Rome, but the children of all of ancient Europe and the Near East combined. And hidden in that extraordinary inheritance, passed down silently across thousands of years, surviving every disaster and every conquest, is something that may be helping some of them live longer than almost anyone else on the planet. Science is still learning what that something is, but it has found it. It is real. And it was there all along, waiting to be discovered, written in the oldest language of all, the language of DNA.